Morning everybody, the last Jackanory before the half-term break. We're going to round off SEO Trot this morning and find out if the plan to increase Alfie's size bit by bit has paid off for Mr. Hoppy. So, without further ado, we'll get to the conclusion of the adventure. Here goes. You'll remember Mrs. Silver yesterday had just had the first thoughts as to whether Alfie was actually getting bigger. And she was quite excited about it. Here we go. Weigh him, Mr. Hoppy ordered. Take him in and weigh him quick. See if he's heavier, Mrs. Silver, said Mr. Hoppy. So Mrs. Silver did just that. And in half a minute she was back, holding the tortoise in both hands and waving it about. Oh, he is heavier, he's heavier. Guess what, Mr. Hoppy? He is heavier than ever before. Oh, it's just wonderful. Oh, isn't he a little darling? Oh, you great big wonderful tortoise. Just what a clever boy you are. Tell Mr. Hoppy what a clever tortoise you are. Mr. Hoppy suddenly felt very brave. Mrs. Silver, he said, do you think I could pop down to your balcony and could I hold him myself? Why, of course you can. This is the greatest of days. Come down at once, dear man. Mr. Hoppy couldn't believe his luck, so he rushed down the stairs and Mrs. Silver opened the door for him and in he went. Together they went onto the balcony. Oh, just look at him. Isn't he grand? Oh, he's a great big tortoise now. Oh, you did it, Mrs. Silver. You're a miracle worker. No, don't be silly. You're the miracle worker, Mr. Hoppy. Oh, but what am I going to do about his little house? He must have a house to go into at night, but no, he can't get through the door. He's so big. They were standing on the balcony looking at the tortoise, who was trying to push his way into his house. But he was too big. I shall have to enlarge the door, won't I? Mrs. Silver said. Don't do that, Mr. Hoppy said. You mustn't go chopping up such a pretty little house after all. He only needs to be just a tiny bit smaller. He can get in easily then. How can he possibly get smaller now he's got larger? Said Mrs. Silver. That's simple, Mr. Hoppy said. Change the magic words in the rhyme I gave you. Instead of telling him to get bigger and bigger, tell him to get a little bit smaller. But in backwards tortoise language, of course. Will that work? Of course it's going to work. Tell me exactly what I have to say then, you miracle man, Mr. Hoppy. Mr. Hoppy got out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote, SEO Trot, Tegger Tim's Relums are Tib Relums. That'll do it, Mrs. Silver. That's what you need to say to him. Well, I don't mind trying it. I mean, you're very successful with these rhymes. But look here, I wouldn't want him to get titchy small all over again. He won't, dear lady. He won't. Say it only tonight and tomorrow morning, and then see what happens. You might be lucky. If it works, Mrs. Silver said, then you are the cleverest man alive, Mr. Hoppy. The next afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy lifted the tortoise up from her balcony and carried it inside. All he had to do now was find one that was now a shade smaller, so that it would just go through the door of his little house. He chose one, and using what he'd used before, he lowered the new tortoise with his tortoise catcher down onto the balcony below. It wouldn't go through the door. Mr. Hoppy had to pick the tortoise up, and he had to choose another tortoise. And again he tested it. This one went through nicely. Good. He placed the tortoise in the middle of the balcony beside a nice piece of lettuce and went inside to wait for Mrs. Silver coming home. That evening, Mr. Hoppy was watering his plants on the balcony when suddenly he heard Mrs. Silver's shouts. She was very excited. "Oh, Mr. Hoppy, Mr. Hoppy, where are you? Just look at this." Mr. Hoppy knew what it was all about. He popped his head over the railings and said, "Yes, Mrs. Silver, what's up?" "Oh, Mr. Hoppy, it has worked, it has worked. Your magic words have worked again on Alfie. He can now get through the door into his little house. It is an absolute miracle. You are a miracle worker." "Can I come down and have a look?" Mr. Hoppy shouted back. "Come down at once, my dear man." Mr. Silver couldn't believe it. "Oh, come down at once," she said, "and see the wonders that I have worked. This is amazing." Mr. Hoppy ran straight down from the balcony into the living room, jumped on his tiptoes like a ballet dancer between the sea of tortoises that covered the floor. He flung open his front door and flew down the stairs 2 at a time with the love songs of 1,000 cupids ringing in his ears. "This is it. This is it. It's the greatest moment of my life coming up. Oh, I mustn't mess this one up. I must keep very calm. I mustn't panic. I must be ready for the moment." When he was 3/4 way down the stairs, he caught sight of Mrs. Silver already standing with the door open, waiting to welcome him with a huge smile. She flung her arms around him and cried out, "You really are the most wonderful man I have ever met. You can do anything. Come in at once. Let me make you a cup of tea. That's the least that you deserve." Seated in a comfortable armchair in Mrs. Silver's parlour, sipping his tea, Mr. Hoppy was all of a twitter. He looked at the lovely lady sitting opposite him and smiled at her, and she smiled warmly back. That smile of hers, so warm and friendly, suddenly gave him the courage he needed, and he said, "Mrs. Silver, I know this is sudden, but will you marry me, please?" "Why, Mr. Hoppy! Well, I didn't think you'd ever get round to asking me. I've been waiting for so long. Of course I'll marry you." Mr. Hoppy got rid of his teacup, and the two of them stood up and embraced warmly in the middle of the room. Socially distanced, of course, a pretend hug. "It's all due to Alfie, you know. He's brought us together." "Oh, good old Alfie. We'll keep him forever and ever." The next afternoon, Mr. Hoppy took all his other tortoises back to the pet shops and said they could have them for nothing. Then he cleaned up the living room, leaving not a cabbage leaf nor a trace of tortoise anywhere. Just a few weeks later, Mrs. Silver became Mrs. Hoppy, and the two of them lived happily ever after. P.S. I expect you're wondering what happened to little Alfie, the first original tortoise. Well, because he'd been mixed up and gone back to the shops, he was bought by a lovely family a week later, by a small girl called Roberta Squibb, good name. And he settled down in Roberta's garden, and every day Roberta fed him lettuce and tomato slices and crispy celery, and in the winters he hibernated on the dry box of leaves in the tool shed. You see, well, that was a long time ago though now, and Roberta has now grown up and is married and has children of her own. She lives in another house, but Alfie's still with her, still the much loved family pet. And Roberta reckons that Alfie's now about 30 years old. It has taken him all that time to grow twice the size he was when Mrs. Silver first had him. But he made it there in the end. What a lovely end to the story. They all lived happily ever after. Mr. and Mrs. Hoppy and Alfie a long and happy life with his new family. I love it when we have happy endings. We haven't had many happy things to smile about in the last few weeks, have we guys? But I hope you've enjoyed the daily dose of Jackanory. Well, we're going to take a break for a few days from Jackanory, but we will return on Monday the 22nd of February with a brand new adventure. And I'm rather hoping it's the last adventure before we're all back together. Although I do like our daily Jackanory check-ins. So, be careful, stay safe, keep reading at home, and I will see you for more stories Monday 22nd of February. Take care, readers, for now. Stay safe.